Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 94 of the Feeling Good podcast. We're continuing this week with the 50 methods in 50 minutes, metaphorically. And this is part 2. And we are starting now with the section on uncovering techniques, which we have talked about, by the way, in the past. But number 25 is the individual downward arrow.
Yes, and just to remind people that these are just a list of 50 techniques, and you don't throw these techniques at patients.
Right.
You work with patients systematically, and this would be things that you could do with a motivated patient who you formed a good relationship with, and there's a thought on their daily mood log, like I'm a loser or whatever it happens to be, or I know when I give my talk, my mind will go blank, I'll make a fool of myself. And then these are techniques that you can help the patient crush that thought. And we're usually using a recovery circle where we take the patient's negative thought and put it in a circle with 16 arrows coming out of the circle. And each arrow would be a different technique that might help the patient challenge the thought in the middle of the recovery circle. Now, the uncovering techniques are really, really cool. You can think about techniques as horizontal techniques and vertical techniques. In a horizontal technique, you challenge the negative thought, like, I shouldn't have screwed up, and then you talk back to that thought. When you do an uncovering technique, you ask the patient to draw a downward arrow under the technique, and then you lead them to the self-defeating beliefs under the surface that we referred to earlier. So when you do the individual downward arrow, you're trying to get at the self-defeating beliefs that trigger depression and anxiety, and they're generally what I call self-esteem equations. Like, to be a worthwhile human being, I need substance X. And then substance X could be perfection or great achievement or approval or love.
Yeah.
So the way you do it is you take the negative thought, you have them put a downward arrow under it and say, if that were true, what would it mean to you? Why would it be upsetting to you? And whatever the patient says, or if you're doing this with yourself, whatever you tell yourself, you write it down, and then you put another downward arrow under it.
And then you ask the same question.
And you write it down. And then when you get to the bottom of the barrel, which is generally, then I'd be a worthless human being and I'd be miserable forever. That's generally the bottom of the barrel. Then if you review,
or I'll die.
Yeah. And then you review the chain of downward arrow thoughts and look at my list of 23 common self-defeating beliefs, and it becomes very easy to identify your self-defeating beliefs.
Yeah, great. So number 26 is the interpersonal downward arrow.
Yes. If the negative thought you're working with on the daily mood log has to do with an interaction with other people, an example of that would be a psychologist who was doing personal work at one of my workshops, dealing with his own insecurity because his patient had committed suicide. He hadn't been using my brief mood survey, and then he was ashamed and guilty and sad and angry and frustrated. And one of his negative thoughts was, if my colleagues find out that I had a patient commit suicide, they'll look down on me. They'll judge me. And so then when you do an interpersonal downward arrow, you just take that thought and you ask 3 questions about it. If that were true, what would that tell you about the kind of people they are? What is their role in the relationship with you? That's the first question. Second question, if that were true, what would that tell you about the kind of person you are? What's your role in this relationship?
Yeah.
And then the third question, what are the rules that connect these roles? You see, the other person's role, your role, and then the rules. What behavioral rules do you have to follow?
That's kind of a difficult question to ask people. They may not know what the rules are in the relationship.
Yeah, well, it's actually super easy with this new form I've created called the rules and the roles. And so just to take this example, we'll make it just an abbreviated version. This fellow, what adjectives in his mind describe his colleagues?
Judgmental.
Right. Harsh, superior, mean-spirited. That's their role. What adjectives describe his role?
Flawed.
Yeah, what else?
Subservient.
Right. Inferior. Weak.
Yeah.
Unimportant.
Yeah.
And then the third question is, how would it feel for weak, subservient, inadequate, inferior you to be relating to harsh, superior, judgmental them?
Feel pretty bad.
And what are the names of those bad feelings?
I feel, again, inferior, probably lonely, embarrassed, ashamed.
Anxious.
Worried. And so on, yeah.
How about hidden anger?
Yeah.
Resentment?
I might, yeah.
And why does it have to be hidden?
Does it have to be hidden? It doesn't have to be hidden.
It does have to be hidden. Why?
Maybe because it's not acceptable.
Right, because inferior you can't be angry at powerful them. And that's one of the rules. What does inferior, inadequate, subservient you have to do? What rules to relate to harsh, judgmental, mean, superior them? What rules?
Good question.
Well, number one, you have to be phony. You have to keep your anger and resentment hidden.
Well, that was the first rule.
Yeah, that's right. And then you have to be unassertive. You can't express your own point of view. You have to hide your flaws. You always have to try to impress them. You always have to be vigilant and on edge, so they don't attack you. Can you think of any other rules that you would have to follow?
You might have to, protect yourself.
Mm-hmm. Can you ask for help?
No, because then you would have to reveal your weaknesses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a lonely, anxiety place to be, and then that's essentially psychoanalysis at warp speed. We've just completed 5 years of psychoanalysis in 7 minutes, and then you say to the person, "Does this seem valid to you? Do you relate to people like that?" And they'll always say, "Yeah, that's exactly me." And then in a few minutes, we'll talk about how to be cured once you know what your core conflict is.
And so this was demonstrated in episode 40.
Yep, that was 40.
And number 27 is the what-if technique. Another uncovering technique.
No, 41. Number 41 is the what-if technique. 27 is the hidden emotion.
I'm not listing the episode numbers. I'm listing the numbers of the techniques.
Oh, okay.
So technique number 27 is what-if technique.
The individual downward arrow you can learn more about in podcast 39.
Yes.
The interpersonal downward arrow you can learn more about in podcast 40.
Yeah. I'm
sorry, I got screwed up there. Now we'll do the 40 what-if technique, which you can hear about in podcast 41.
Yes.
And then the what-if technique was developed by Albert Ellis, I believe, and you take a thought on a daily mood log with a patient who's very anxious, who says, "Oh gosh, when I give my talk, my mind will go blank." Mm-hmm. And then you say, if that were true, what's the worst that could happen? What are you the most afraid of?
Yeah.
And they put a downward arrow, and whatever they say, you write it down. Or if you're doing this for yourself, whatever comes into your mind, you write it down. You might say, well, if my mind goes blank, I'll look like a fool. Okay, we'll put that down. And why would that be upsetting? What would that mean to you? Well, then people will start to judge me, and they'll get bored, and they'll walk out before my talk is over. And then, okay, and write that down. And then what if that happened? What are you the most afraid of? Well, then they'll start spreading the word about me.
Yeah.
And then what? Well, then my career will be ruined, or some such thing. And then you get to the core fantasy that's at the root of the person's fears, which in this case would be they believe that if people saw them being flawed or screwing up, then their whole life would fall apart. People would judge them. Word would spread about them, and that they have to try to impress people, or some terrible rejection will begin to spread.
Yeah. Okay. So the 28th technique is the hidden emotion technique.
This is a powerhouse technique for treating anyone with anxiety. It's one of the least used techniques, least understood in the treatment of anxiety, but it's exceptionally important. We had 2 podcasts on it, 27 and 43. And it's the idea that almost everybody who struggles with anxiety, at least 80% of them are exceptionally nice people. And when something comes up, they get upset about something. And I'm like this myself, so I can tell you this really does happen. You kind of sweep your negative feelings under the rug, and you can't even remember that you're upset. And then it comes out indirectly as some form of anxiety, or maybe a somatic aches and pains that have no organic basis. And when you use the hidden emotion technique, you bring that hidden problem to conscious awareness and then have the patient do something to solve the problem or express the feelings. Right. We had a perfect example of that on our last podcast with a young woman who was hypochondriacal, constantly going to doctors thinking something terrible was wrong with her, when in reality the issue was that she was upset with her boyfriend and didn't think it was right to talk to him because she was overly nice, overly inhibited. And then once she talked to him about the issue that had been bugging her anxiety finally disappeared after 9 years of failed therapy.
Yeah. So moving on to the motivational techniques, very important in team, we have the straightforward and paradoxical Cos Benefit Analysis.
This is one of the first cognitive therapy techniques I created way back in the 1970s. And there are actually 10 forms of Cos Benefit Analysis, but essentially there's 5 straightforward versions and 5 paradoxical versions. But essentially, let's say you can take something like a negative thought, I'm such a loser, or the thought I'm hopeless and will never recover from depression. And then you list all the advantages of believing that and giving yourself that message and all the disadvantages. And then you balance them in 2 circles at the bottom, put 2 numbers that add up to 100. Is it 50-50, 60-40, 40-60? What feels greater to you? It's really a motivational technique, but it can really be mind-bendingly effective when cognitive techniques are failing. That's a cognitive cost-benefit analysis for a thought like I'm a loser. You can do it for a self-defeating belief, like I should always try to be perfect, or my worth depends on my achievements. Well, what are the advantages of believing that? How will it help you? And then in the right-hand column, what are the disadvantages? What price do you pay for this belief? And then you can balance them.
How does that differ from the previous one?
Well, the previous one is for a negative thought on a daily mood log. And that's a cognitive cost-benefit analysis. Like when I get up in front of the audience, or when I get on the plane is going to crash. So
it's for negative thought, and this one is for the self-defeating belief. But essentially, you do the same thing.
It's the same thing, but it's just whatever you put at the top of the thing. And then you can do it for a behavior, or you can do it for a negative feeling. Yeah. Like, let's say someone is angry. That's one of the toughest feelings to get rid of until you do a cost-benefit analysis. What are all the advantages of being angry with this person or angry at the world? Yeah. What are the disadvantages? And then balance them off. Maybe the advantages are greater. Maybe you want to be angry, so God bless you. You can be angry.
Yeah.
But or it can be for a habit like eating too much, or for a relationship problem like blaming your spouse.
Now, what makes a cost-benefit analysis paradoxical?
Well, that would be if you only look at the advantages of the negative thought or the negative feeling, rather than the disadvantages.
So then you don't do the two circles.
No. You just list all the benefits of the negative feeling, and then you say to the person, well, given all those advantages, why would you want to give that up? Maybe that's not something we should be working on. So you actually paradox the patient. I could probably give you an example of that if you want.
Well, we'll have to do an episode on this.
Okay.
That would be worth doing. So the 30th technique is the devil's advocate technique.
Yes. Now, this is a great technique. We've done multiple podcasts on it. One was podcast number 87, in case you want to get
rather recently. Yeah,
live example. But this is the opposite of externalization of voices, or it's similar in a way. This is for positive thoughts. Externalization of voices is for negative thoughts. So when you do the devil's advocate technique,
tempting thoughts
that tempt you to overeat or to drink too much or to engage in, spending too much money at a sale or whatever it happens to be, or smoking pot, too much pot. And so you do this with a friend. You write down all your tempting thoughts, and then ask your friend to tempt you with your own thoughts. Yeah, and see if you can defeat the thoughts. For example, what's your favorite kind of chocolate, Fabrice?
I like hazelnut.
That's right.
Milk chocolate.
Hazelnut. I was trying to remember that the other day. I'm going to try to get some for you the next time I'm at a place. And just imagine that there's some hazelnut milk chocolate here, and then I might be your tempting thoughts and say, Fabrice, why don't you because I know you're on this low carb diet. Fabrice, look at that hazelnut milk chocolate. Just take a little bite.
I see it, and I'm not going to take a little bite because I just don't do that when I commit to something.
Yeah, but you've had a hard day, and you deserve it. And just imagine it melting in your mouth. You could just touch it to your lips right now and just lick it a little bit.
No, I have had a hard day, and that doesn't mean that I deserve the chocolate, because that's not part of the regimen I'm following. I do have other things that I can do to reward myself, though.
Okay, so you win. That's how the devil's advocate technique goes. And it's a great technique.
By the way, one difference between the devil's advocate and the externalization of voices is there's no role reversal.
Oh, that's right. In devil's advocate, you should not do role reversals. If the person can't defeat the tempting thought, just say, well, maybe this isn't something you want. We should be working on that. And that's again a paradoxical technique called sitting with open hands. You never try to help a patient with a habit or addiction.
Yeah.
The next technique, stimulus control, just follows from the other. And if you're tempted by enough hazelnut milk chocolate, eventually you're going to eat some.
Yeah, if it keeps happening, we only have so much resistance.
Exactly. And so stimulus control just means don't expose yourself to the thing that you give into. Like if you love glazed donuts, well, don't walk past that donut store on the way to work every morning.
Yeah.
It's a humble but incredibly important technique.
This is often used in harm reduction for substance addiction, like alcohol. They say, just don't have any alcohol in the house, and don't go to bars, and don't spend time around people who drink.
Exactly.
30-second technique is the decision-making form. I used it recently with a client.
Well, tell us how it worked. I've changed the name to decision-making tool because form sounds like a tax.
Oh yeah, right. Yes.
Thing, but the decision-making tool is really cool. It's a bit complicated, but it's really awesome.
It is, because there's a little bit of a calculation to be done, but I'll try to synthesize. You have a choice between two options. Either going to the mountain or going to the ocean for vacation, or maybe marrying somebody or not marrying somebody, or it could be a big or a small decision. And each choice has some advantages and some disadvantages. And so you make a list of all the advantages of choice A, all the disadvantages of choice A, all the advantages of choice B, and all the disadvantages of choice B.
On one sheet of paper, there's four compartments.
There's 4 quadrants. And then you do a little bit of a Cos Benefit analysis, but 2 by 2. So you take the advantages of A and versus the disadvantages of A. So you do a little bit of a CBA. But then you do the same for B, and then you compare the advantages of A versus the advantages of B, and the disadvantages of A versus the disadvantages of B. Now, as you explained in the cost-benefit analysis, you have 2 circles where you put 2 numbers that add up to 100. Well, you do this 4 times. And so that sounds a little bit complicated suddenly, but when you do it, it's very clear. It gives you a weight to each of your quadrants.
Right.
And then you do a quick subtraction to see what each choice is worth to you. And
total points for option A and the total points for option B, and they can both go from plus 200 to minus 200.
Yeah, that's the range. And, you can have A be worth 50 and B be worth minus 20. That's kind of a no-brainer. A is definitely the winner, and vice versa if you have in the other order. But you could have, minus 60 for A and minus 60 for B, and you're going, wow, they're both terrible choices. Maybe I should find a choice C.
Right. Or it may be, that's called a can't-win situation where both choices come out very negative. And what's one possible reason for that?
What is one possible reason for that? That you're not thinking of the right choice.
Well, but other than that?
You could be depressed and only see the negativity in things.
Exactly. So you've got real heavy weightings on the negatives for both options. I think in a previous podcast I mentioned a fellow who was trying to figure out whether to, get divorced or whether to go into couples therapy with his wife, and they both came out intensely negative because he absolutely didn't want to be married to his wife. And so that was a very negative option. But then he thought that if he got divorced, he'd lose all of his friends and everyone would judge him. Yeah. So that was a very negative
It's a
choice.
Case of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah. So depending on how the pattern comes out, there's all kinds of cool ways you can work with it.
Okay. So the 33rd technique is the daily activity schedule. Interesting one. I haven't used this one before.
I haven't used it for decades. It was one of the earliest things. The early cognitive therapy techniques were pretty primitive because we had a kind of a primitive view of what depression was, I would say. It was, and then the daily activity schedule was just focusing on the fact that when people are depressed, they often lie around doing nothing. And so it's a schedule where it lists the 7 days of the week, and then 8 to 9 a.m., 9 to 10 to 11 little boxes for every hour. And then the patient puts in what they were doing, and then they put an M for mastery or a P for pleasure. If they gave them a sense of mastery or sense of pleasure, and they can rate it from 0 to 5, like P 0 to 5 and M 0 to 5. And so then the therapist can kind of look over it and see what the patient is doing and what are the things that give the patient some reward and what are some of the things that aren't particularly helpful. As I say, we've got vastly cooler techniques now, like my pleasure predicting sheet would be, say, a far more interesting way of boosting pleasurable activities and testing certain hypotheses and beliefs the patient has at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's, in fact, the next one.
Yes. 34th is the pleasure predicting sheet. Yeah.
And that's episode 74, podcast 74, if you want to hear about it. But essentially, this was a technique I developed where you ask the patient to list a series of activities for pleasure or satisfaction or learning or personal growth in the first column. In the second column is they put who they did it with. So if it's with yourself, you put self. You don't put the word alone because you're never alone. You're always with yourself. or maybe it was with your spouse or a friend. And there are things that shouldn't necessarily take too long. Like it could maybe go to a movie with a friend, or eat a donut if you're hungry, or go out and do your jogging, spend 10 minutes cleaning up your desk, something like that. And then in the third column, you predict how pleasurable or satisfying it's going to be on the score from 0 to 100. And then in the last column, after you do each activity, you write down how rewarding or satisfying it turned out to be on the scale from 0 to 100. And you can do all kinds of neat things with it, but a lot of times depressed people predict things will be really unrewarding, then they go do them and find out they're far more rewarding than they thought.
Yeah, it's about the inaccuracy of our prediction of our own emotions.
Yes, as well as our memory of what's going on, because often patients will tell you, well, if I'm alone, I'm miserable and I'm only happy when I'm with others. And then they start looking and they are often just shocked to discover some of their happiest times were things they were doing by themselves. Yeah. And some of the more miserable times were interactions with other people. So it can help sometimes crush these self-defeating beliefs that are at the heart of the depression.
Yeah. And so related to that is the 35th method, the anti-procrastination sheet.
That's very similar, and we had podcast number 75 on that one, showed exactly how to do it. But it's another activity schedule. But what you do, you take a difficult task and you break it down into little tiny steps. The first part of it, and steps that can be completed in, say, 30 seconds or 1 minute. Like today, I had to prepare some kind of a tax form that I started in January, and Melanie said, "Oh gosh, David, it's due in a day or two." I've been putting it off because it makes me so anxious.
Yeah.
And so I said, the first thing is just find where I left off in the computer working on it. And then that's step 1. And then step 2 would be look it over. And then step 3 would be, do the next calculation that's required. These are real simple little things to do.
Yeah. And
then in the next column, you predict how difficult each step will be between 0 and 100. And I was predicting like 80% difficult, 90% difficult. I thought this was going to be very, very difficult. And then you predict how satisfying it's going to be between 0 and 100. And then in the last 2 columns, after you do each step, you put how satisfying and difficult it turned out to be.
It's in fact, this is a version of the experimental technique.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, good point. And I was surprised that there was a little difficulty. I had to find out where in the computer the correct paperwork was.
Yeah.
And that took about a minute to find it. And then I started looking over it, and I realized I'd almost completed it in January. And I only have just a few little things to do. And
good news.
It was a lot easier than what I thought. That's the anti-procrastination sheet.
All right. So then...
Exposure techniques.
Oh, yes. Now we're on the exposures. So the first one here, 36 technique, is the gradual exposure and flooding.
Right. And
that should be actually 2 techniques in my opinion, but...
Probably.
Tell me what you think.
Yeah, and probably on my new list of 101 techniques for my new book, I'll probably make them 2 techniques.
Yeah.
But this is podcast 76 we had on this, and this is one of the classic techniques for dealing with any fear or phobia. And you can't be cured of any fear unless you confront the monster you fear the most. Whether it's fear of heights or fear of bees or fear of public speaking or fear of flying or social anxiety or obsessive compulsive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, whatever it happens to be, as long as you avoid the thing you fear, which is what 100% of anxious people do 100% of the times, your fear will intensify.
Yeah.
You can't be cured until you confront the fear. You can confront the fear in one of 2 ways. Let's say you have the fear of heights. Well, you can start going up on a ladder, one rung at a time. Maybe the first day you can go and stand on the first rung of the ladder, and you keep going to the first rung over and over until you're no longer afraid of standing on the first rung.
Yeah.
Then you go to the second rung and you repeat that process, and then the third rung until finally, after a period of days or weeks, you can stand on the top of the ladder.
Yeah.
That's gradual exposure. You can do it with the fear of blood. Any kind of fear, you can challenge it with gradual exposure. Flooding is where you just do it all at once. Like, and we've talked in a previous podcast, when I was in high school and had the fear of heights, the teacher...
Yeah, speaking of ladder...
Yeah, he just told me to stand on the top of this ladder, and he would stand on the bottom and wait for me until my fear of heights disappeared. Yeah. It took about 15 minutes, and then it was gone in a flash. And I did the same thing because of my fear of blood. I went and worked for a month in the emergency room of Highland Hospital in Oakland, which is a major trauma center.
Yeah.
And the very first day I worked there, this bloody fellow who was a bomber, his bomb had blown up in his hands when he was going to blow up City Hall, and it blew up in his basement. But he was brought in, and he was still alive, but he was covered with blood. And the nurses made me go up and use a toothbrush to try to scrape the gunpowder out of his wounds.
Yeah.
And I had to work with my hands all bloody, and I was in a panic, but I mean, it was a life and death thing, and I couldn't stop doing it. I had to confront my fear. And again, after 10 or 15 minutes, suddenly my fear totally disappeared, and then I just loved working in at Highland Hospital in the emergency room. It was a fantastic hospital. Yeah. Really, the people were so warm and skillful and down to earth. It was one of the great experiences of my life, really.
And if I'm right, I think that you have a little bias of gradual versus flooding.
Yes, my bias is flooding. That's what I personally prefer, but they both work very well, and it just depends on what you and your patient prefer.
Right. The 37th method is response prevention.
Yeah, and this is just a little twist on exposure. When people have obsessive compulsive disorder, they have frightening obsessions, like a law student would be driving down the street, and then he would think that he would see a homeless person, and then he'd hit a bump on the road. And you think, I wonder if that bump on the road, I wonder if I ran over that guy. And he knew he hadn't run over the guy, but he couldn't get it out of his head. And so then he would go and pull the car over by the side of the road and walk back until he could find the homeless person. And then he would feel relieved, and then he would drive on. And then he would think, well, maybe I just threw some tacks out on the road. Could puncture someone's tires, and he'd pull the car over and make sure there were no tacks on the road. And he spent hours every day with this kind of checking behavior. And people with severe OCD fall into this, and it's an addiction, because when you check to make sure you're safe, it creates relief, temporary relief from the anxiety. So you get addicted to checking things.
Right.
And in response prevention, you simply say to the patient, or you say to yourself, if you're a patient struggling with this, that you're not permitted to do the checking behavior. You can't keep checking the mailboxes. You can't keep checking to see that the stove is turned off. You can't pull over to the side of the road and be looking for dead bodies. And
that's in order to extinguish the addiction to the checking. In fact, OCD stands for obsessive compulsive.
Yeah.
The obsession part is the thought, like, I hit that homeless person, and the compulsion is the behavior you use to relieve it, which is the checking.
Right. And I was just thinking that when you're under stress, you may develop like a little OCD tendency. When my wife had her certification exam coming up, my wife is a very sane and rational person and a wonderful woman. But she was in downtown Los Altos, and she went over a bump in the road, and she developed the idea that she might have run over someone's foot. And she started worrying about it more and more. And she wanted to call the police and ask if anyone had, been a hit and run, have gone over someone's foot. But she resisted doing it. But we get into these kind of kooky patterns. And then when you resist the compulsion, you go into withdrawal. And so you'll get more anxious for a couple days because you're not giving in to that urge.
This is a known behavioral pattern. It's called extinction.
Right. And if you stick with it, after a couple of days, the urge to do the compulsion will disappear.
Yeah.
You'll still have the obsessions, and for that we have tons of other techniques.
So still in the exposure techniques, we have the 38th, which is distraction.
Yeah. Now, this is my least favorite of all of the 50 techniques.
I know, I don't like it very much either.
You don't either. But we used to think that if you're anxious, you can distract yourself from the anxiety and do something else.
And it sort of works.
Yeah, a little bit.
But it's temporary, it doesn't have any lasting effect.
Yeah. But I think that EMDR is a combination of exposure plus distraction.
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and so they have people with anxiety from a trauma or something think about the traumatic event and then jiggle the eyes back and forth to kind of maybe distract them from the anxiety.
Right, exactly. So they can do the prefrontal cortex processing without having the amygdala going,
And they put it in that scientific scientism language to make it sound scientific, which it isn't. But they have a whole lingo to persuade the patient this is why it works. But that version of distraction has a lot of fans.
Yeah. So 39th is cognitive flooding. So we're mixing cognitive and flooding.
Yeah.
How's that?
And that's just simply that if the thing that you're afraid of you can't confront in reality, like you can't, if you have a fear of being in a plane crash, you can't go and crash a plane to get over your fear. You'll get over your fear, but you'll be dead. But you can fantasize being in a plane crash. And if you can make yourself incredibly anxious and just stick with the anxiety and make yourself as anxious as possible, after a period of time, which might be as short as a few minutes or could take, many minutes, but eventually the image that's upsetting you will lose its power to upset you, and eureka, you're cured.
So it's really a guided imagery or a sort of hypnosis, maybe?
It has overlap with all of that. You're not guiding the image toward anything peaceful, however.
Right. That's the difference.
You want the patient to maximize the anxiety and make it as awful as possible.
Next one is image substitution. I don't know this one. What is it?
Well, it's very simplistic. When I gave my first academic talk, I had incredible public speaking anxiety, and it was even worse than I thought it was going to be. I imaged it all night the night before and fantasized making a fool of myself and doing a terrible job and everybody scorning me. And that's really what happened. Mm-hmm. I won't go into the details, but that was it. And then I won an award for the research that I had been reporting, which was unexpected, and was asked to give a talk before 1,000 scientists in New York when I received the award. And so every night before I went to bed, I fantasized it in a very positive way. Instead of imagining making a fool of myself, as I had the first time, I would imagine being relaxed and enthusiastic and not using my notes and just talking to them and praising my collaborators and how fabulous they were. And then imagine at the end they'd all come rushing up to the podium to congratulate me. Yeah. I didn't believe the images.
But you visualized them.
But I visualized them. And then that's exactly how it came out. Uh-huh. And now I kind of make my living in large part on public speaking.
Right.
But for example, let's say you have a fear of flying and you have to go on a trip and you imagine the plane crashing. Well, you go ahead and do that. Imagine the plane crashing. And then when you're at the maximum anxiety, then imagine it landing and getting off the plane and feeling fantastic because you defeated your fear, or fantasize when your baby was born, or some happy moment in your life, like graduating from high school or whatever. The only problem with this is that you're trying to control or defeat the anxiety. And I've gone more in the other direction of cognitive flooding, which I think is more powerful.
Yeah. So 41st method is memory rescripting.
Yeah, and I think we've covered that already.
We talked a little bit about it.
When you have a person fantasize a horrible memory, like I had one of a woman who was abused by the next door babysitter when she was growing up, and he still lived next door, and she fantasized all the time how he would come sneak into her room and fondle her, and then so I had her image that during a session, and she got very anxious, and I said, now we can change the memory, and she decided to come into the memory as a big powerful adult and brand him, pull him off of her, of course, off of herself as a little girl, and then brand a P in his forehead with a cattle branding iron. And she said, I can hear him screaming, I can smell his flesh burning, and it seemed to be extremely helpful for her.
It's a form of empowerment, You feel like you have control suddenly,
Yeah, you're no longer in the role of victim.
Yeah. So on to the interpersonal exposure techniques. So we have 42nd method, smile and hello practice.
Well, these interpersonal exposure techniques are among my favorites. And here, this seems humble, but actually I had to do this myself because I had an extreme, shyness, social anxiety. But you just tell the shy patient to walk up to at least 10 strangers every day and just smile and say hello, no matter how anxious that makes you.
Yeah.
And it's really very, very powerful. I was so anxious myself that I started out with inanimate objects. I felt like I couldn't smile properly. And see, I can do it now.
Well, I know.
But I would just
say, see you smile all the time.
Say, oh, hi, you're such a nice little glass. And I would just smile at a glass and say hello. And then once I got good at that, then I would say hello to animals, like dogs are good.
Yeah.
Because they'll come up and lick your face, and you tell them what a cute dog you are, and they're
so forgiving.
Yeah. And then you start doing it with humans, and it can be really a powerfully helpful, but initially frightening technique for shy people. Now, the reaction you get will depend on where you live. And
that's a good point.
To be prepared for that, because here in California,
it can be cultural.
When we go on Sunday hikes, we meet other hikers, we smile and say hello.
Yeah, people are responsive to this.
100% of the time. But when I went up to New York to be on the Phil Donahue show, a national television show, I arrived earlier, and I was with a colleague, and so we had to walk around Rockefeller. Well, we walked around Rockefeller Plaza to kill about 30 minutes. So we smiled and said hello to every stranger. We smiled and said hello to 50 strangers, and not a single one.
They called the police.
Yeah, not a single one smiled or said hello back. So, but it's a great technique, though.
This is going to date you, or date us, I should say. The 43rd is the David Letterman technique.
Yeah, we have to have a new name. Now, this technique changes its name every 10 years. It started out with the... who was that original talk show host?
Yes, Johnny Carson.
Yeah, it was started out as a Johnny Carson technique. So who should we call it now? Who's a good?
Well, we could say Oprah, but even she's getting
ancient.
Yeah. I don't know.
We asked Jay Leno, but now he's been gone for years.
Stephen Colbert.
Stephen Colbert technique. There you go. And this is another good one for shy people. You tell them to watch these talk show hosts who make millions of dollars talking to strangers.
Yeah.
And what techniques do they use? And they use 4 of my 5 secrets of effective communication. They use the Disarming Technique, thought and feeling, empathy, inquiry, and stroking. In other words, they get the other person talking about themselves.
Yeah.
They don't use much I feel statements or much talking about themselves.
No, because it's not about them.
Yeah. But shy people make the mistake of trying to talk about themselves to impress others, which only bores others.
Yeah.
And so you can train people to in the office, first practice how you would talk to a stranger. You could do role play with the patient. Like I might say, Fabrice, I noticed you have a kind of a neat accent. Is that a French accent? Where are you from?
Yes, I am from France. Yes.
Oh, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Corsica.
Oh, I don't even know where Corsica is. It sounds like an exotic location. What's it like?
It kind of is. It's an island in the Mediterranean. Is
it like super beautiful?
It is very nice, yes, indeed.
Oh, wow. I'd love to hear,
exactly.
That's other-centered. That's the Stephen Colbert technique.
Yeah.
And once the patient is good at it in the office, then you have them go out and approach people on the street or someone waiting for a bus and do this with 10 strangers every single day. These things freak out the anxious patient, but they're extraordinarily helpful. And I've often gone out with my patients doing this technique also.
Yeah, and in fact, people end up having a good time doing this because they connect.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
44th method is the self-disclosure.
Shy people are almost always ashamed of their shyness. And that's a bigger problem than the shyness itself.
That's right, yeah.
And so you have them, give them the assignment of, say, approaching 5 strangers every day and tell the stranger that they feel shy and ashamed of their shyness. So you could say something like, could I talk to you for a minute? This might sound weird, but I just wanted to tell you that I've been struggling with shyness all of my life. I'm afraid to talk to people. I'm real ashamed of my shyness. And I just decided today, what the heck, I'm going to stop hiding and start telling people, and that's why I just told you. And that's self-disclosure. And it actually works. It works really well, and I've used so much self-disclosure myself, and it's incredibly helpful to me. It's a relief. It's the hiding of your shyness that causes the problems.
45th is flirting training.
We're going to have a flirting training session in 2 or 3 weeks on my Sunday Facebook broadcast with Angela Crum.
Oh, really? Okay.
From the Feeling Good Institute. She's an expert on flirting. And flirting is actually something you can teach people how to do. And it's extremely important for shy people to learn how to do that. And it's very empowering and helpful. Most shy people are so nervous and tense and serious. They could come across too serious.
Right.
And this turns people off. And so you can teach them how to flirt with people in a warm, friendly, lighthearted way.
How do you do the training of it?
Well, you have to listen to the Facebook broadcast to see all the things, but one very kind of a silly, superficial thing, but it's been helpful to a lot of my patients, is to give, I tell this to women, like, shower men with compliments. They like that.
Right.
However, the compliments have to be fake or they won't work. So, for example, let's say you meet some guy and he's ugly as sin, but he's has about a 200 IQ.
Uh-huh.
You don't tell him he's smart. Everyone tells him he's smart. But you just look into his eyes and you say, oh, there's just something about you that is so cute. But I bet women tell you that all the time. And if it's not true, it works so well because you're being lighthearted and you're blowing smoke in his face. Or let's say he's really just so handsome looking, but, his IQ is about 12. And you say something to him like, oh gosh, there's something about you that seems so intelligent. But I bet you hear that all the time. And so you're kind of playing with him in a friendly way, affectionate way, kind of silly in a way. And that's kind of what flirting is about. It's like having fun rather being so deadly serious and needy. And Angela's got a lot of tips on that she's
maybe I should watch that broadcast. So
no, you're so cute you wouldn't have to.
Yeah, people tell me that all the time. So 46 is rejection practice.
Yeah, this is a cool technique that I did when I was a medical student with a friend. And then I later heard that Albert Ellis did the same thing when he was young. But I'll just tell you how Ellis did it. He was a psychologist in New York, and he was terribly afraid of rejection. And so he forced him. People have heard Ellis. Of course, he's dead now. But if you've heard Ellis, you've heard this story. But if you've never heard Ellis, you haven't heard the story. So he forced himself to walk up to 200 women in 2 weeks and ask for a date. Because he wanted to get over his fear of rejection.
And boy, did he get rejected.
Yeah. He said he got 199 rejections and only one woman accepted the date, gave him his phone number. And then he said that she never showed up. But he got over his fear of rejection, and then he developed the reputation of quite the womanizer. He wrote a column on sex and love advice for either Playboy magazine or Penthouse magazine, and he became quite the notorious womanizer.
In fact, there's a website called 100 Days of Rejection Therapy.
Oh, really?
And it's called actually rejectiontherapy.com.
Oh.
And if you go there, the guy who wrote the website is giving you 100 days of different things you can do and get yourself rejected.
Oh.
Like the first one is borrow $100 from a stranger.
Oh, yeah. Right. That's a good one. Yeah, that's creative. I like that. But I did that myself as well with a friend. We just spent 2 weeks. I skipped my medical school classes, and we just walked around San Francisco and Palo Alto, and we gave each other instructions: go up and introduce yourself to her and ask for a date. And we both got 100% rejections. But we got over our fear of rejection. It was helpful in a peculiar way.
So,
boy, we're almost done.
I know. Moving on to the interpersonal techniques, which we'll be hard pressed to do a minute on each.
Well, we'll just do
We'll so the 47th
superficial.
One, yes, exactly. So we're back to Cos Benefit Analysis, but this is the relationship Cos Benefit Analysis.
Yes, and I would say if you want to learn more about these interpersonal techniques, to pick up a copy of my book, Feeling Good Together.
Yeah.
And you can get it on Amazon.com, and it will really show you everything about how to heal troubled relationships. But the relationship cost-benefit analysis, or the blame cost-benefit analysis, is just based on the idea that 80% of the time when people have conflicted relationships, they're blaming the other person.
Right.
And if you go in with that mindset, there's no way to improve that relationship. Yeah. And so you could list all the advantages of blaming the other person, and then list the disadvantages and balance them on a 100-point scale and say which is greater. Is it 50-50, 60-40, 40-60? What is it?
Yeah. And
my daughter and I did this as an exercise for my book, Feeling Good Together, and together we came up with something like 34 completely different advantages of blaming other people. You feel superior. You feel you're right and they're wrong. You can gossip about them. You don't have to feel guilty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a very interesting exercise of blame cost-benefit analysis.
48th is revise your communication style.
We have a much better name for that one now. This is a little old list because it's so boring sounding, called the Relationship Journal.
Yeah.
And it's an interpersonal enlightenment tool. It's one of the most powerful tools I've ever created, but it's painful because it results in the death of your ego. And it's a 5-step process, and you focus on a moment that you weren't getting along with someone, and you write down, what did they say? That's step 1. And how were they feeling when they said that to you? And you circle all their emotions. And then, what exactly did you say next? And you circle all the feelings you were having. And then, like, give you a simplistic example. Maybe somebody said something to you like, "Oh, you never listen." That's what they said to you. And then your response was, "I'm listening right now." Something like that. Mm-hmm. And then in step 3, you look at your response and say, was that good or bad communication? Did you acknowledge the other person's feelings? You'll find out you didn't. Did you share your own feelings openly?
Right.
You'll find out you didn't.
Yeah, typically, yeah.
Did you treat them with respect? You'll find out you didn't.
Right.
That's somewhat painful. And then in step 4, you say, what will be the impact of the way I responded on the other person? What will they do next? So if you were telling me, David, you never listen, I say, I'm listening right now. What will be the impact of that statement?
It's going to be off-putting.
Yeah. So they'll keep criticizing you.
Yeah.
So what you see is you're forcing the other person to treat you badly. Yeah. That's step 4. And that's interpersonal enlightenment. Instead of blaming them, you suddenly see your own role in the problem. And that's very painful. And a lot of patients cry when we get to this stage of the relationship journal. And some people can't tolerate looking at their own role, won't look at their own role. They want to keep blaming. But if you're willing to do it, then if you have the power to make your relationship terrible, you also have the power to make that relationship beautiful. And then in step 5, you use the 5 secrets of effective communication to respond differently to the other person. And that's our next technique.
Yeah. I was searching to see if we had an example of the relationship journal anywhere, but I don't think we do. In fact, we're still looking for...
But no, we're going to do this Saturday. We're going to illustrate it with Lee.
Oh, okay. All right. So that's when we're going to be doing
We're going to record an actual interpersonal therapy session. Jill and I will be the co-therapist, this fellow from England. Lee is going to be the patient.
All right.
And
so
he's already started the relationship journal.
Yeah, to be coming up in a future episode.
Yes, soon.
I don't know when we'll be broadcasting that one, but yeah.
But within a month or two.
All right, I guess.
For sure, yeah.
And, of course, the 5 secrets
of effective communication.
That's the
and we've
biggie.
Had 6 podcasts on it. If you want to really learn these, number 65 through 70.
Yeah.
And also number 77, you said.
Yeah.
But there's 5 communication techniques that if you get skillful at using them, and takes a tremendous amount of practice, you can resolve 90% of conflicts with other people. And they're arranged by EAR, ear, speak with your ear, empathy, assertiveness, and respect. And the 3 listening skills, the empathy skills, are the disarming technique. That's where you find truth in what the other person is saying instead of arguing with them or defending yourself. Then there's 2 forms of empathy, thought empathy, which is you repeat their words, and feeling empathy is you acknowledge how they're likely feeling based on the words they used. And inquiry, you use gentle probing questions to learn more about how the other person's thinking and feeling. Those are the listening techniques. Disarming technique, thought and feeling, empathy, and inquiry.
Yeah.
And then the assertiveness techniques is called I feel statements. That's where you share your feelings openly with the formula I feel X, and X can be any of a number of words from the feeling words chart. I'm feeling a little hurt right now. I'm feeling sad, whatever it is. And then stroking is conveying warmth, liking, and respect, even in the heat of battle. And we're going to have a podcast coming up soon, maybe our next podcast, I'm not 100% sure, but on these 5 secrets are fantastically effective at bringing peace and joy to anyone if you learn to use them. But there's tons of reasons that people resist and want to maintain conflict with others rather than warm, loving relationships. And we'll go into some of the resistances that people have soon.
Yeah. And finally, the 50th method is the 1-minute drill.
I can't believe we got to number 50.
We did.
This is a a pretty simple technique when you're treating couples, and there are many more couples techniques than just this one, but this is a simple one. And you have the let's say it's a traditional husband-wife. You say one of them, I want you to be the talker, and you say to the other, I want you to be the listener. And so the talker can express, let's say if the wife is the talker first, and she expresses her negative feelings, and she can say anything she wants, and the husband's job is just to listen and take it in. You're not allowed to say anything. You can't agree, you can't disagree. You're just like a court reporter.
Yeah.
What did your wife say, and how was she likely feeling?
Yeah.
That's what you want to figure out. So when she's done, then the husband says, here's what I heard you say.
Yeah.
And then you summarize it as best you can. And then your wife will give you a grade between 0 and 100, how accurate that was. If you're 95% accurate or better, then you can do a role reversal. If you're less than 95, let's say you're only 80%, then you say to your wife, tell me the part I missed, and then she'll say what you didn't get was blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And then you summarize that, and then she'll say, oh, that's 100 or that's 95.
In your experience, how many round of doing this did you have to do with your clients for them to get to 95%?
Only 1 or 2.
Okay.
But you have to have, but see, I mentioned you don't throw these techniques at people.
Yeah.
I say that and people don't hear it.
Yeah.
They're going to do it anyway, and then they'll be disappointed.
Yeah.
So you've got to first have an agenda with both of them. Yeah. That they want to develop a more loving relationship.
Right, of course,
and that they're willing to work on themselves and change themselves rather than trying to force their spouse to change. And that they have goodwill, and they're not a hidden agenda to get out of the marriage. If you have motivated people, they can get up to 95 pretty fast. If you've made the mistake of trying to help a couple where one or both are unmotivated, then you can do this for 1,000 years and it won't work.
Yeah. Well, David, I would say that we're failures.
Yeah.
Yes, because we said we would do 50 methods in 50 minutes, and we spent 2 one-hour podcasts on it.
Yeah, well, let's put her there.
Yes.
We survived, and hopefully you
that was a high five,
too.
by the way.
Yeah, right.
So I would like to add one thing for our listeners, which is, so we went very, very quickly on all of those methods. But if any of those, catches your attention, you want to hear more about it, please do leave a comment in the show notes so that we know, what resonates with you, and this is how we decide to do our episodes based on the feedback that we get from people.
One other important point that I keep forgetting to mention is we have every month now more than 50,000 downloads of these podcasts. Yeah. But only 100 or so people read the show notes on my website. Yeah. You're listening from YouTube or iTunes or who knows what all, where people are getting these. I would encourage you, if you're interested in these podcasts and really want to learn, to go and sign up on my website, feelinggood.com, www.feelinggood.com. Feeling good is one word with 2 G's in the middle. And in the upper right of every page, there's a widget, and you can sign up to get all of my blogs. Yeah. And then you'll get the show notes, which in some cases they're brief, but in other cases I put a tremendous amount of effort into supplementary materials to really help you learn what we're focusing on. I'd love to see more of you signed up. Well,
essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what happens is that when people get this episode in their podcast player, at the same time, if they go to their mailbox, if they've signed up, they'll have a link to the show notes. Is that right? Don't they get like a notification saying,
that's how it works.
Podcast.
Yeah, you get it in your mailbox and you click on it and it brings you right automatically into the show notes, and then you can get extra free goodies, you might say. Right. Now, you don't want to try to read the show notes if you're driving in your car. That's justified. Just listen and focus on your driving.
We're not recommending that.
We don't want to lose some of our fans through auto accidents.
Well, I hope we get lots more comments.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, Fabrice. Always a pleasure.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donzel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.